By 1781, the revolution had dragged on for 6 long years, and both sides were breaking. What had begun with passionate declarations and bold optimism had devolved into grinding war of attrition that consumed men, money, and morale with relentless efficiency. The Continental Army had won battles and survived winters that should have destroyed it, but decisive victory remained elusive, while British forces controlled key ports and could reinforce their positions by sea whenever American pressure threatened their holdings. The stalemate after years of brutal fighting from New York to the Carolinas had created exhaustion that affected everyone involved in conflict that seemed capable of continuing indefinitely without resolution. British commanders could not crush American resistance despite superior training and equipment, while American forces could not drive British from fortified coastal positions that Royal Navy could supply and reinforce. Neither side possessed strength to achieve decisive victory that would end war on favorable terms. Exhaustion bred uncertainty about whether independence could actually be won, or whether years of sacrifice would end in negotiated settlement that fell short of complete separation from Britain. Congress struggled to maintain army and field, states resisted providing supplies and money, soldiers deserted when pay failed to arrive, and enlistments expired. British forces faced similar problems, as war's costs mounted, and public support in Britain declined with each passing year of inconclusive campaigning. Both sides desperately searched for final blow that would break stalemate and produce victory after years of fighting that had achieved nothing except mutual exhaustion. Washington needed decisive success that would force British to accept American independence, while British commanders sought crushing defeat of Continental Army that would end rebellion and restore imperial control. The war that wouldn't end needed ending, but nobody knew how to accomplish it. He commanded an army, but not a future. Washington remained stuck outside New York with forces insufficient to assault British positions that General Clinton defended, with thousands of troops behind fortifications that made direct attack suicidal. The strategic paralysis frustrated General, who understood that time favored Britain's superior resources and that prolonged stalemate would eventually exhaust American will to continue fighting without achieving independence that justified years of sacrifice. Washington's inability to strike decisive victory created political pressure from Congress and state governments that wanted results after investing years and fortunes in military campaign that seemed no closer to success than when it began. Critics questioned his leadership and suggested alternative strategies, undermining confidence in commander who had kept Continental Army alive through impossible circumstances, but could not deliver final victory that everyone demanded. His position became increasingly precarious as frustration mounted over war's endless continuation. His private doubts emerged in letters where he confessed uncertainty about how to break stalemate, without French naval support that could challenge British control of sea and prevent reinforcement of their coastal fortresses. Washington recognized that land operations alone could not defeat enemy that possessed maritime superiority, but French commitment to providing decisive naval intervention remained uncertain, despite alliance that had brought French troops to America, but not yet committed French fleet to coordinated operations against British positions. The general's dilemma was strategic and political. He needed to act decisively to justify continued confidence in his leadership, but acting without adequate resources would risk destroying Continental Army in failed assault that would end revolution through military catastrophe. His frustration grew as months passed without opportunity for decisive action that might end war he had been fighting since 1775. All revolutions need friends, but this one needed a fleet. France's entry into war in 1778 had provided crucial diplomatic recognition and financial support that sustained American resistance when British blockade and continental currency collapse threatened to strangle revolution economically, but French military contribution remained limited to troops under Rochambeau, who reinforced Washington's army without fundamentally changing strategic balance that favored British maritime superiority. Admiral de Grasse commanded French naval forces in Caribbean that could potentially challenge Royal Navy's control of American coast if French government committed fleet to supporting operations against British positions. The crucial shift from land stalemate to joint operations required coordination between American and French commanders who spoke different languages, served different governments, and pursued objectives that sometimes aligned and sometimes conflicted based on their nation's distinct strategic interests. Washington and Rochambeau developed working relationship based on mutual respect, despite cultural differences and competing pressures from their respective governments. Rochambeau brought professional military expertise and disciplined troops that strengthened Continental forces, while Washington provided strategic vision and understanding of American political situation that French commander lacked. Their cooperation would prove essential to exploiting opportunities that neither could achieve independently. The French alliance tested both sides' commitment to shared goal of defeating Britain. Despite different motivations, Americans fought for independence, while French fought to weaken hereditary enemy and restore prestige lost in 7 Years' War. These divergent purposes created tensions that had to be managed carefully to maintain cooperation necessary for successful joint operations. French support was essential but complicated, requiring diplomatic skill alongside military coordination. While Washington waited, Cornwallis chased glory in the South. The British Southern strategy aimed to rally Loyalist support in Carolinas and Virginia while defeating Continental forces through aggressive campaigning that would demonstrate British military superiority and convince wavering colonists to abandon rebellion. Cornwallis pursued this strategy with energy and confidence, winning battles at Camden and Guilford Courthouse while driving through region that British believed held sympathetic populations ready to support royal authority once American military presence was eliminated. Cornwallis's campaign through the Carolinas demonstrated tactical brilliance but strategic confusion, as victories failed to produce lasting control over territory that British forces could not permanently occupy without garrison. Strength they lacked. Each successful battle drove Continental forces away temporarily, but did not destroy American capacity to return once British moved on to next objective. The illusion of control masked reality that British held only ground their armies physically occupied, while surrounding countryside remained hostile or neutral. His advance into Virginia represented escalation of Southern campaign and pursuit of decisive victory that had eluded him in Carolinas, despite multiple battlefield successes. Cornwallis believed that Virginia was key to suppressing Southern rebellion, and that aggressive operations would force American surrender once their forces were driven from field and their supply sources eliminated. His overconfidence reflected British assumption that professional military superiority would eventually prevail over colonial resistance. The general's decision to concentrate forces in Virginia and establish fortified base from which to conduct operations would prove fatally flawed when circumstances changed and assumptions about British naval control were tested by French fleet that Cornwallis did not anticipate. His pursuit of glory would lead him into trap that he helped create through strategic choices that seemed reasonable until they became catastrophic. He chose Yorktown and sealed his fate. Cornwallis selected small tobacco port on Virginia Peninsula as base for operations, believing its position near Chesapeake Bay would allow Royal Navy to supply and reinforce his army while providing secure location from which to conduct raids against Virginia's interior. The decision reflected standard British strategic thinking that relied on naval superiority to support coastal operations while avoiding exposure to superior American forces inland where British mobility advantage disappeared. Cornwallis dug extensive fortifications at Yorktown, committing his army to defensive position that assumed British naval control would remain unchallenged, and that American forces lacked capability to mount successful siege against properly fortified position defended by professional troops. His confidence came from years of British naval dominance and from low estimation of American military competence that previous battles had seemingly confirmed. The arrogance of empire meeting patience of revolution created a situation where British assumptions about permanent advantages would be tested decisively. The position had fatal weakness that Cornwallis either did not recognize or believed irrelevant. It was vulnerable to combined land and naval siege if enemy could achieve temporary naval superiority, and concentrate enough ground forces to prevent British escape inland. The peninsular location that seemed strategic asset because it facilitated naval supply became strategic liability once those supplies could be interdicted by hostile fleet controlling the bay. Cornwallis's choice of Yorktown would be remembered as catastrophic strategic error, but it reflected reasonable calculation based on British advantages that had proven reliable throughout war. His fate was sealed not by obvious mistake but by convergence of circumstances that changed strategic situation in ways that made previously sound position untenable when American and French forces exploited opportunity that British assumptions had created. He made the British think he was marching on New York while he vanished south. Washington executed one of history's most brilliant military deceptions, creating elaborate preparations for assault on British positions around New York, while secretly planning 400-mile march to Virginia, where Cornwallis's army offered vulnerable target if French fleet could achieve temporary naval superiority. The deception required maintaining appearance of imminent attack through visible troop movements and construction of siege equipment, while actual army departed southward through New Jersey. Washington and Rochambeau's march to Virginia required extraordinary coordination between American and French forces, moving through difficult terrain while maintaining secrecy essential to surprise that would trap Cornwallis before British commanders could respond. The logistical challenge of moving thousands of troops with artillery and supplies across 400 miles was immense, made more difficult by need to conceal movements from British intelligence network that monitored American activities. The deception succeeded brilliantly as British commanders in New York prepared to defend against attack that never came, while Washington's combined army reached Virginia and joined forces under Lafayette that had been containing Cornwallis. By the time British realized what had happened, it was too late to reinforce Yorktown or evacuate Cornwallis's trapped army. The march demonstrated Washington's strategic vision and ability to coordinate complex operations with French allies. One of most brilliant deceptions in military history succeeded because Washington understood British thinking and exploited their assumptions about American capabilities and intentions. The feint toward New York held British forces in place, while real threat developed in Virginia, where Cornwallis had isolated himself through strategic choices that seemed reasonable until Washington exploited their weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. The fate of America rode on the wind. Admiral de Grasse sailed north from Caribbean with French fleet powerful enough to challenge British naval forces in Chesapeake Bay, where control of sea would determine whether Cornwallis could be supplied and reinforced or trapped and destroyed. The Battle of the Chesapeake, on September 5, 1781, was brief naval engagement with strategic consequences far exceeding its tactical scope. French victory drove British fleet away from Virginia coast and established temporary French naval superiority that trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. Control of the sea decided fate of empire, as British inability to maintain naval supremacy destroyed strategic foundation that their entire American strategy depended upon. Cornwallis at Yorktown could not be evacuated, could not be reinforced, could not be supplied except by land routes that American and French forces were cutting systematically. The Royal Navy's failure to defeat de Grasse meant that British army in Virginia was isolated and vulnerable to siege that it could not withstand indefinitely. The naval battle demonstrated that British advantages were not permanent and that French intervention could create opportunities for American victory that land operations alone could never achieve. Washington had waited years for French naval support decisive enough to challenge British maritime control, and de Grasse provided exactly what revolution needed at moment when strategic situation made such intervention decisive rather than merely helpful. When sails appeared on horizon, Cornwallis realized he was alone. The French fleet's presence meant no rescue from sea, no reinforcement of his besieged garrison, no escape from trap that was closing around 8,000 British troops who had entered Virginia confidently, but now faced prospect of surrender or destruction without hope of relief from commanders who could not reach them. When the sails appeared on the horizon, Cornwallis realized he was alone. French naval victory at Chesapeake Bay, meant that British Army at Yorktown was cut off from sea-based supply, and reinforcement that British strategy throughout war had relied upon to maintain coastal positions against superior American numbers inland. Cornwallis understood immediately that his strategic situation had become precarious, though he still hoped that Royal Navy would return in strength to drive off French fleet and re-establish British naval control. American and French forces converged on Yorktown from multiple directions, completing encirclement that prevented British escape inland, while French fleet blocked escape by sea. The convergence was executed with precision that demonstrated improved Continental Army professionalism and effective Franco-American cooperation that had been developing since French troops arrived in 1780. Washington's army from north joined Rochambeau's French forces and Lafayette's troops that had been shadowing Cornwallis through Virginia. A noose of earth and fire tightened around 8,000 British troops, who found themselves trapped in fortified position that had seemed strategic asset, but became prison once enemy-controlled approaches by land and sea. The psychological impact on besieged garrison was immediate, as soldiers recognized that their situation was desperate and that relief might not arrive before starvation or bombardment forced surrender. British confidence from years of military superiority dissolved as reality of encirclement became apparent. Closing the trap represented culmination of Washington's strategic patience and French support that finally provided naval superiority necessary to exploit British vulnerability. The siege of Yorktown would test whether combined American and French forces could successfully conduct formal siege operations against professional British Army defending fortified positions. For 3 weeks, the earth itself became a weapon. Allied armies began systematic siege operations that followed European military conventions for reducing fortified positions through combination of trench approaches and artillery bombardment designed to breach defenses and force surrender, without costly direct assault. American and French troops dug parallel trenches that approached British fortifications progressively, moving siege guns closer to walls until artillery could batter defenses at effective range. The grinding, relentless pressure of siege warfare wore down defenders who could not prevent Allied trenches from advancing despite counterattacks and artillery fire that attempted to disrupt siege operations. Every night brought Allied trenches closer to British positions. Every day brought more artillery into range to bombard fortifications that could not be maintained under sustained fire from positions that British lacked strength to assault and drive back. Siege warfare was a methodical process that favoured attackers who possessed superior numbers and adequate supplies, while defenders could only delay inevitable outcome unless relief arrived from outside. Cornwallis recognised that his garrison could not withstand extended siege without reinforcement or resupply that British naval defeat had made impossible. His only hope was that Royal Navy would return before Allied siege operations breached his fortifications or before starvation forced surrender. The human cost of siege was measured not in dramatic battles, but in steady casualties from artillery fire and disease that spread through cramped fortifications where sanitation deteriorated and supplies diminished daily. Soldiers on both sides endured miserable conditions, but Allied forces knew they were advancing toward victory, while British defenders understood they were trapped without realistic hope of successful resistance. Night and day, the sky was never silent. The devastating Franco-American artillery assault subjected British positions to bombardment that destroyed fortifications, killed defenders, and made life within siege lines unbearable through constant threat and noise that prevented rest and shattered nerves. Allied artillery superiority demonstrated French professional expertise, combined with American determination to prosecute siege with maximum efficiency and minimal concern for British suffering. Red-hot cannonballs set fires throughout Yorktown as heated shot ignited wooden structures and created additional hazards beyond explosive shells that demolished earthworks and stone buildings. Collapsing walls buried defenders and created breaches that Allied forces could exploit once bombardment had sufficiently weakened fortifications. The terror inside British lines grew as bombardment continued day after day without respite and without realistic prospect of ending before garrison was destroyed or forced to surrender. The artillery assault was psychological warfare as much as physical destruction, demonstrating to British defenders that they were trapped and powerless, while Allied forces methodically destroyed their positions with overwhelming firepower that defenders could not effectively counter. British artillery responded but lacked ammunition and positions to match Allied bombardment that came from multiple directions simultaneously. The thunder of Yorktown could be heard for miles as hundreds of cannon fired continuously, creating cacophony that announced to surrounding countryside that decisive battle was occurring. Local residents evacuated from combat zone, while soldiers endured bombardment that represented 18th-century warfare at its most brutal and methodical, where technology and numbers overwhelmed courage and professional training through sustained application of destructive force. It came down to 2 earthen forts and a bayonet charge in the dark. Allied forces needed to capture redoubts 9 and 10, British fortified positions that anchored defensive line and prevented final parallel trench from being completed close enough to British main works to make assault practical. The positions were strongly defended and represented last significant obstacles to completing siege operations that would force British surrender. American and French forces stormed the British defences simultaneously in nighttime assault that required soldiers to advance under fire and fight hand-to-hand against professional troops defending prepared positions. The attacks demonstrated courage and improved Continental Army capability, as American troops matched French professionalism in executing coordinated assault against defended fortifications. Alexander Hamilton led American attack with ferocity and tactical skill that captured Redoubt 10 despite British resistance. Hamilton's attack became a legendary moment that demonstrated American military competence and personal courage of officer who would become prominent political figure after war. His willingness to lead assault personally and his success in capturing objective validated Washington's confidence in young officers who had developed through years of campaigning. French forces captured Redoubt 9 simultaneously, demonstrating effective Franco-American coordination and shared sacrifice. The successful assaults broke last significant British defensive positions and allowed Allied forces to complete final siege preparations that made Cornwallis's position untenable. British counterattack attempted next day to recapture lost redoubts failed, confirming that Allied control was permanent and that British resistance was collapsing under sustained pressure that Garrison could no longer withstand effectively. His army was trapped, his men starving, his hope gone. British counterattacks failed to dislodge Allied forces from captured positions or to disrupt siege operations that approached British main defences relentlessly. Disease spread through Garrison as unsanitary conditions and inadequate food weakened soldiers who faced bombardment daily while understanding their situation was hopeless without relief that showed no signs of arriving. Desertion increased as soldiers recognized futility of continued resistance and sought to escape before final assault or surrender that seemed inevitable. Cornwallis struggled to maintain discipline among troops whose morale collapsed as their commander exhausted options for breaking siege or delaying final outcome. His attempts to evacuate across York River failed when weather prevented boats from making sufficient trips before American forces detected movement and interdicted evacuation attempt. The slow death of empire under pressure was visible in deteriorating conditions within British lines, where soldiers went hungry, wounded, lacked adequate medical care, and officers recognized that further resistance served no purpose except delaying inevitable surrender. Cornwallis's pride struggled against military reality that demanded he seek terms before Garrison was destroyed through assault that Allied forces were preparing to launch. British resistance crumbled not through single decisive battle, but through accumulated pressure that siege warfare applied systematically until defenders could no longer sustain organized resistance. Cornwallis recognized that requesting surrender terms was only rational choice remaining, though decision meant accepting defeat and humiliation that would shock Britain and validate American independence struggle that British had believed they could suppress through military superiority. On October 19th, the Redcoats marched out to the tune of a funeral song. The formal surrender of Cornwallis's army followed military conventions, where defeated Garrison marched between lines of victors to lay down weapons in ceremony that acknowledged victors' triumph while preserving defeated. Soldiers' honor through ritualized submission. British troops marched with colors cased and band playing melancholy tune. Reportedly, the world turned upside down, that captured symbolic significance of British defeat by colonial forces they had dismissed as militarily incompetent. Washington's silent dignity during surrender ceremony demonstrated his understanding of moment's historical significance and his respect for military formalities that softened humiliation of British defeat. He maintained proper distance and formality, appropriate to commanding general, receiving surrender of professional army that had fought courageously despite impossible strategic situation. His restraint contrasted with jubilation among American troops who celebrated victory that seemed to confirm independence after years of uncertain struggle. The visual spectacle of British regulars surrendering to American and French forces who had trapped and defeated them represented reversal of expectations that British military superiority would inevitably prevail over colonial rebellion. The ceremony's formality could not disguise revolutionary implications of moment when professional British army surrendered to forces it had been sent to suppress, acknowledging through ritual submission that American military capability was legitimate and that British conquest of rebellious colonies was no longer achievable. Cornwallis's absence from surrender ceremony, he claimed illness, suggested his personal humiliation and unwillingness to participate in ritual that acknowledged his defeat and American victory. His subordinate conducted formal surrender, while Cornwallis remained in his quarters, avoiding moment that marked end of his army and possibly end of British efforts to suppress American independence militarily. When the guns fell silent, he could barely believe it. The emotional aftermath of Yorktown victory brought not immediate triumph, but disbelief and exhaustion among soldiers who had fought for years without certainty that victory was achievable. Washington reflected on cost of achieving independence through war that had consumed 6 years and thousands of lives, while creating a nation whose future remained uncertain despite military success. Soldiers wept from relief and exhaustion, from joy at surviving, and grief for comrades who had died before seeing victory they had fought to achieve. The emotional release after years of tension and danger affected everyone who had endured a campaign that seemed endless, until it suddenly ended with British surrender that few had believed possible at war's beginning. Victory brought, not triumph, but recognition of what had been sacrificed to achieve independence that now had to be transformed into a functioning nation, capable of governing itself and maintaining freedom that war had secured. Washington understood that military victory was beginning rather than end of revolutionary process, that creating successful republic would require skills and virtues different from those that had won battlefield success. The silence after victory was profound, as armies that had bombarded each other for weeks suddenly stopped, and soldiers processed what had occurred. British defeat at Yorktown would likely end active military operations, though formal peace negotiations remained ahead. The war that had consumed years of everyone's lives was effectively over, though nobody yet understood fully what had been achieved or what challenges independence would bring. News from Yorktown hit London like a thunderclap. British political establishment reacted with shock to reports that Cornwallis had surrendered entire army to combined American and French forces, understanding immediately that defeat represented not tactical setback, but strategic catastrophe that made continued military effort to suppress American rebellion politically and financially unsustainable. Parliament turned against war that had cost fortune without achieving victory, with opposition demanding end to military operations and negotiations for peace. Political crisis in Britain following Yorktown brought down North's ministry and elevated politicians committed to ending war and recognizing American independence, rather than continuing military campaign that Yorktown had proven incapable of achieving British objectives. The shift in British politics was rapid and decisive, as members who had supported war policy abandoned positions that defeat made untenable politically. The first cracks in global British Empire appeared as Yorktown demonstrated that imperial power had limits and that determined colonial resistance could achieve independence despite Britain's military and economic advantages. The defeat had implications beyond America, as other colonial populations observed that British authority could be successfully challenged and that empire's military reputation was not invincible. British reaction to Yorktown revealed how completely American victory had changed strategic calculus that had favoured British throughout war. The defeat was not merely military loss, but political earthquake that destroyed British will to continue fighting and forced recognition that American independence was inevitable. Empire that ruled much of world had to admit that it could not suppress rebellion in 13 colonies. In 1783, the empire that ruled the world had to admit defeat. Treaty of Paris negotiations produced formal recognition of American independence and established boundaries for new nation that Britain acknowledged as sovereign rather than rebellious provinces subject to royal authority. The diplomatic negotiations required both sides to compromise on details, while accepting fundamental reality that Yorktown had established American independence was fact that Britain could not reverse militarily. Recognition of American independence reshaped global power by establishing precedent that colonies could successfully revolt against European empires, and that national self-determination was achievable through sustained resistance. The treaty acknowledged that 13 colonies were now United States with sovereignty equal to European nations, fundamentally changing international system that had been based on European imperial dominance. The peace negotiations addressed territorial questions, treatment of loyalists, payment of debts, and other practical matters that followed from American victory. British concessions were substantial, granting United States territory extending to Mississippi River and recognizing complete independence without conditions that might have preserved some British influence or authority. The world entered New Age, born from fall of old imperial order, as American success inspired revolutionary movements and nationalist aspirations in other regions where European colonial control seemed permanent, until American example demonstrated that independence was achievable. The treaty marked not just end of American Revolution, but beginning of era, when colonial peoples would increasingly challenge European imperial domination that Yorktown had proven vulnerable. 3 weeks ended a war and began an empire of a different kind. Yorktown siege lasted from late September to October 19, 1781, but those 3 weeks determined outcome of 6-year war and established American independence as irreversible fact. The victory represented true birth of United States as nation, capable of defending sovereignty and commanding respect from European powers that had doubted American viability. Reflection on Yorktown reveals how combination of strategic patience, effective alliance management, and exploitation of enemy mistakes produced decisive victory that conventional military analysis suggested was impossible for weaker power fighting global empire. Washington's leadership, French support, and British strategic errors converged at Yorktown to create opportunity that Allied forces exploited decisively. The victory that destroyed one empire became foundation of another, the American one that would eventually rival and surpass British power that had seemed invincible in 1775. United States would develop into global power through expansion, economic growth, and eventually military strength that made it dominant force in Western Hemisphere and beyond. Yorktown's legacy extended beyond American independence to reshape international order and inspire democratic movements worldwide. The siege demonstrated that determined resistance could defeat imperial power, that alliances could overcome superior force, and that new nations could emerge from successful revolutions. American empire of different kind would be built on principles of republican government and national self-determination that contradicted European imperial models, though United States would face its own contradictions between democratic ideals and imperial practices as nation expanded across continent and eventually overseas. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.